He never hired a black maid before. Then he entered his room and found her sleeping next to his children. The brass doorknob turned with the softest click. Richard Hartwell stepped into the dimly lit nursery, expecting to find empty beds and silence. Instead, he froze. There, on the narrow space between his 6-year-old daughter Emma's bed and 4-year-old Marcus's crib, lay Naomi Washington. Her dark hand rested protectively over Emma's small fingers. The three of them breathed in perfect synchrony, their faces peaceful in the amber glow of the nightlight. Want more stories that feel like they were made just for you? Like, subscribe, and you won't miss a single one. Richard's leather shoes made no sound on the hardwood floor as he backed away from the doorway. His heart hammered, not from anger, but from something he hadn't felt in the 2 years since Sarah's death. Relief. Is it too much? But again, when was the last time they slept so soundly? 3 weeks earlier, Richard had stood in this same hallway, watching his 7th nanny pack her bags. Mrs. Henderson had lasted longer than most, nearly 2 months, before declaring his children unmanageable. Emma's nightmares. Marcus's refusal to speak. The endless parade of caregivers who saw only problems where Richard saw grief. They need structure, Mrs. Henderson had said, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Professional distance. These children are too attached, Mr. Hartwell. It's unhealthy. Richard had watched her go with the same hollow feeling he'd grown accustomed to. Another failure. Another stranger who couldn't see past his children's pain to their hearts. The agency had called the next morning. "We have someone," the director said. "Naomi Washington. She's different from our usual candidates." The pause had been heavy with unspoken meaning. "Send her over," Richard had replied. Now, standing in his foyer 3 weeks later, Richard remembered the moment Naomi first walked through his front door. She moved with quiet confidence, her brown eyes taking in the grand staircase, the crystal chandelier, the family portraits lining the walls. But her gaze had lingered longest on the small touches. Emma's forgotten doll on the marble floor, Marcus's toy cars scattered across the Persian rug. "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Hartwell," she had said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Your children must love playing here. Not, 'What a mess,' or 'They need more discipline.' Just understanding." "They're upstairs," Richard had said, leading the way. "Fair warning, they don't warm up to new people easily." But Naomi had simply nodded, following him up the curved staircase with steady steps. The meeting had been different from the start. Emma, usually hidden behind Richard's legs when meeting new nannies, had emerged from her bedroom doorway like a curious cat. Marcus, who hadn't spoken to a stranger in months, had actually made eye contact. "What's that in your bag?" Emma had asked, pointing to the worn leather satchel Naomi carried. "Stories," Naomi had replied, crouching to Emma's eye level. "Would you like to see?" She had pulled out a collection of picture books, some new, others clearly well-loved, and spread them on the floor. Marcus had crept closer, his thumb still firmly planted in his mouth. "This one's about a little girl who plants a garden," Naomi had said, opening to a page filled with bright illustrations. "And this one's about a boy who builds the tallest tower in the whole world." Emma had sat cross-legged beside her. "Daddy says Mommy planted flowers before she went to heaven." Richard's breath had caught. Emma rarely mentioned Sarah anymore. "I bet they were beautiful flowers," Naomi had said simply. "Just like the ones in this story." By the time Richard had finished showing Naomi around the house, the kitchen, the playroom, the children's schedules, Emma was curled against her side, listening to a story about brave mice who saved their kingdom. Marcus sat nearby, stacking blocks with more focus than Richard had seen from him in months. "They seem comfortable with you," Richard had observed. "Children know when someone sees them," Naomi had replied. "Really sees them." Richard had hired her on the spot. The changes had been gradual but profound. Where other nannies had imposed rigid schedules, Naomi had created gentle rhythms. Morning pancakes shaped like animals. Afternoon tea parties with stuffed bears. Evening walks around the garden where Sarah's roses still bloomed. Most importantly, she had listened. When Emma whispered about missing Mommy's bedtime songs, Naomi had learned Sarah's favorite lullabies. When Marcus cried for stories only Daddy could tell, she had gently encouraged Richard to take over, stepping back without making it feel like a failure. "She's working miracles," Richard had told his sister Catherine during one of their weekly phone calls. "The kids are laughing again. Really laughing." Catherine's response had been cooler than usual. I'm sure she's competent. But Richard, people are talking. What people? Our people. The Ashfords asked about her at the club. Mother's Garden Circle has been speculating. You know how it looks. Richard had gripped the phone tighter. How it looks? A widowed man, alone in that big house with a young woman. And well, she's not like the others you've hired. The implication had hit him like ice water. You mean she's black? I mean she's different, Catherine had said quickly. Different background, different everything. Mother thinks perhaps someone more traditional. The children adore her, Richard had interrupted. She's brought life back to this house. I'm sure she has. But appearances matter, Richard. Your reputation. The children's future. You need to think about what's appropriate. Appropriate. The word had followed him for days, echoing in his mind as he watched Naomi help Emma with her reading, as she patiently taught Marcus to tie his shoes, as she hummed quietly while preparing their meals. What was appropriate about 7 nannies who had treated his children like inconveniences? What was appropriate about letting his family dictate who belonged in his home? But the seed of doubt had been planted. It grew stronger 2 weeks later, during the monthly family dinner at his mother's estate. The Hartwell clan gathered every 4th Sunday, a tradition Sarah had endured rather than enjoyed, but one Richard maintained for the children's sake. This time, the conversation had turned to household staff. I had to let my gardener go, announced his cousin Margaret, her diamond earrings catching the light from the chandelier. Caught him going through my jewelry box. You can't trust them, added his Uncle Harold, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. That's why Elizabeth and I only hire through the Pemberton Agency. They do thorough background checks. Only the right sort. Richard had felt the comment like a physical blow. The Pemberton Agency, the same one that had sent him Mrs. Henderson and 6 others before her. The same one that had never asked about his children's needs, only his budget and preferences. Of course, some families aren't as careful, Margaret had continued, her gaze sliding meaningfully toward Richard. They get desperate and make unconventional choices. What's that supposed to mean? Richard had asked, his voice carefully controlled. Nothing at all. His mother, Eleanor, had interjected smoothly. We're just concerned about you, dear. You've been through so much, and sometimes grief clouds our judgment. My judgment is fine. Of course it is, Eleanor had continued. But perhaps it's time to consider a more permanent solution. The children need stability, structure. Someone who understands their background, their expectations. Someone white. The words had hung unspoken, but unmistakable. Naomi understands them perfectly, Richard had said. She's the best caregiver they've ever had. I'm sure she's very nice, Catherine had said carefully. But Richard, think about their futures. The schools they'll attend, the circles they'll move in. Shouldn't their caregiver prepare them for that world? The world that didn't include people like Naomi. Richard had excused himself before he said something he couldn't take back. But their words had taken root, growing stronger each day. When Naomi asked for advances on her salary to help with her mother's medical bills, Richard wondered if Catherine was right about money being her primary motivation. When she stayed late to help Marcus through a difficult bedtime, he questioned whether the boundaries were appropriate. When neighbors asked pointed questions about his new help, he felt the weight of their judgment. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in October. Richard had been in his study, reviewing contracts for a major acquisition, when he heard laughter from the living room. Real laughter, the kind that had been absent from his house for 2 years. He had followed the sound and found Naomi on the floor, playing an elaborate game of pretend with both children. Emma was a princess, Marcus a brave knight, and Naomi was the dragon they had to defeat with kindness instead of swords. You have to say please, Emma instructed solemnly. Mommy always said please was the magic word. Please, Miss Dragon, Marcus had piped up, his voice clear and confident. Please let the princess go. Naomi had roared dramatically, then collapsed in defeat. Oh no, the politeness has made me too weak. I must retreat to my cave. The children had cheered, rushing to hug their defeated dragon. In that moment, watching his son speak full sentences and his daughter smile without reservation, Richard had felt something crack open in his chest. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. But the feeling had been short-lived. Through the window, he had spotted his neighbor Mrs. Crawford walking her dog, her disapproving gaze fixed on the scene through the glass. He had stepped back from the doorway, suddenly seeing it through her eyes. The informality, The physical contact, the way Naomi had made herself at home in his living room. That night, after the children were in bed, Richard had found Naomi in the kitchen, cleaning up from their evening snack. "We need to talk," he had said. She had looked up from the dishes, her expression immediately cautious. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. Is something wrong?" "Not wrong, exactly." He had struggled for the right words. "But I think we need to establish some clearer boundaries." "Boundaries? Professional boundaries. You're wonderful with the children, but I think we need to maintain more distance. More structure." Naomi had set down the dish towel, her movements careful and controlled. "I see. May I ask what brought this on?" Richard had felt heat creep up his neck. "Nothing specific. Just, it's important that the children understand the difference between family and employees." The words had tasted like ash in his mouth, but Naomi had simply nodded. "I understand, Mr. Hartwell. I'll be more mindful of appropriate boundaries." The change had been immediate and devastating. Naomi still did her job, excellently, professionally, but the warmth had disappeared. No more floor games or spontaneous tea parties. No more gentle touches or lingering bedtime stories. She maintained perfect professional distance, and the children wilted like flowers without sunlight. Emma had asked repeatedly why Miss Naomi seemed sad. Marcus had reverted to his thumb-sucking, his newfound confidence evaporating. And Richard had watched it all with growing horror, realizing he had destroyed something precious to appease people who didn't live in his house, didn't know his children, didn't understand what healing looked like. The realization had come to a head the night he found them sleeping together. Standing in that doorway, seeing the peace on their faces, Richard had understood with crystal clarity that his family's disapproval was worth less than his children's happiness. Naomi hadn't overstepped. She had responded to what they needed. A mother's touch, unconditional love, the security of knowing someone would stay. The next morning, he had found Naomi in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with her usual quiet efficiency. "About our conversation the other night," he had begun. She had looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Mr. Hartwell. I was wrong. About the boundaries, about everything. You weren't overstepping. You were being exactly what my children needed, and I let other people's opinions cloud my judgment." For the first time since their talk, Naomi had smiled. "Children know when someone sees them," she had repeated. "I see Emma and Marcus. Not problems to be solved, but little people who've been through something terrible and are trying to find their way back to joy." "I see that too," Richard had said. "And I see that you've been their guide back. I won't let anyone, family included, undermine that again." But his family hadn't given up easily. The pressure had continued through carefully worded phone calls and impromptu visits. His mother had stopped by with potential nanny candidates, all properly credentialed and properly pale. Catherine had forwarded articles about childhood development and appropriate caregiver relationships. Even his father-in-law had weighed in, suggesting that Sarah wouldn't have approved of such an unconventional arrangement. Sarah would have loved Naomi, Richard had told him firmly. She would have loved anyone who made our children smile again. The campaign had reached its crescendo during Thanksgiving dinner at the family estate. The entire Hartwell clan had gathered, aunts, uncles, cousins, and various hangers-on. Richard had brought Emma and Marcus, leaving Naomi at home to enjoy the holiday with her own family. But even in her absence, she had been the elephant in the room. "I hope you're reconsidering your staffing situation," Eleanor had said during cocktail hour, her voice carrying clearly across the drawing room. "The children seem too attached." "They seem happy," Richard had replied. "Happiness isn't everything," his uncle Harold had interjected. "Children need structure, discipline, appropriate role models. This woman you've hired has a name," Richard had said sharply. "Naomi." "Of course. But Richard, be practical. What happens when they start school? When they attend parties and events? They'll expect that level of intimacy from everyone. It's not healthy. What's not healthy is teaching them that love has conditions based on skin color." The room had fallen silent. Even the catering staff had seemed to pause in their duties. Margaret had been the first to recover. "No one said anything about skin color. We're talking about appropriateness, about what's best for the children's development." "Are you?" Richard had challenged. "Because I've never heard you question the appropriateness of Mrs. Patterson's relationship with her grandchildren, and she spent more time raising them than their own parents." "That's different," Catherine had protested. "She's family. So is Naomi. Maybe not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the simple fact that she shows up every day and puts my children's needs first. His mother had set down her martini glass with unusual force. Richard, you're being deliberately obtuse. We all want what's best for Emma and Marcus. But you have to consider their futures, their place in society, the connections they'll need to make, the doors they'll need opened. How does having a maid as a mother figure prepare them for that world? Maybe it prepares them for a better world, Richard had said quietly. One where character matters more than connections. The argument had continued through dinner, growing more heated with each course. By dessert, Richard had gathered his children and left, ignoring his mother's protests about family unity and his cousin's muttered comments about foolish pride. On the drive home, Emma had asked why everyone seemed angry. Sometimes adults disagree about important things, Richard had explained, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. Are they mad about Miss Naomi? Richard's hands had tightened on the steering wheel. Some people don't understand how special she is. But we do. Marcus had piped up from his car seat. She makes the best pancakes. And she knows all the songs Mommy used to sing. Yes, Richard had said, his throat tight with emotion. We do. The final confrontation had come the following week. Richard had been in his office when his secretary announced that Mrs. Hartwell was there to see him. Eleanor had swept into his office with the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. She had been impeccably dressed, as always, but her usual composure showed cracks around the edges. We need to talk, she had announced, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. If it's about Naomi, it's about your children and your judgment. Richard, I've been patient, but this has gone too far. The entire family is concerned. Richard had leaned back in his chair. Concerned about what exactly? About your reputation. About the children's welfare. About this obsession you've developed with defending someone who is, frankly, just an employee. She's not just an employee. She's the person who brought my children back to life. Eleanor had leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she had used when he was a child. I understand that you're grateful, but gratitude shouldn't blind you to reality. This woman has you wrapped around her finger. She's manipulating your emotions, using your children's affection to secure her position. That's not, isn't it? Eleanor had interrupted. Think about it rationally. She arrives when you're at your most vulnerable. She ingratiates herself with the children, creates this false intimacy. And now you're so dependent on her that you're willing to alienate your entire family to keep her. Richard had felt a familiar flutter of doubt. She's not manipulating anyone. How can you be sure? Richard, I've seen this before. Desperate widowers, lonely children, ambitious women who know exactly which heartstrings to pull. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Eleanor had stood abruptly, her patience finally exhausted. Fine. If you won't listen to reason, perhaps you'll listen to consequences. Continue down this path, and you'll find yourself increasingly isolated. The children will suffer for your stubbornness. Doors will close. Opportunities will disappear. Is your pride worth their futures? After she left, Richard had sat in his office for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. His mother's words echoed in his mind, mixing with months of similar warnings from family and friends. Was he being naive? Was his judgment compromised by grief and gratitude? That evening, he had arrived home to find Naomi helping Emma with her homework while Marcus built elaborate structures with his blocks nearby. The scene was so ordinary, so peaceful, that his doubts had seemed ridiculous. How was your day? Naomi had asked, looking up from Emma's math worksheet. Complicated, he had admitted. She had nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Family can be complicated. Did I ever tell you about my grandmother? Richard had found himself saying. My father's mother. She came from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to build something better for her children. Naomi had shaken her head, but Emma had looked up with interest. Great-Grandma Bridget was poor, Emma had said proudly. But she was brave. Very brave, Richard had confirmed. She worked as a seamstress, saved every penny, and eventually opened her own shop. But the other business owners didn't welcome her. They said she didn't belong, that she wasn't the right sort of person for their neighborhood. What happened? Marcus had asked, abandoning his blocks. She proved them wrong. Through hard work and kindness and refusing to let their prejudice stop her. Eventually, they realized she wasn't there to take anything from them. She was there to contribute something valuable. Naomi had met his eyes across the table, and he had seen her understanding. Great-Grandma Bridget sounds like Miss Naomi, Emma had observed. Yes, Richard had said quietly. She does. The revelation had come the following weekend, during what would become known in family lore as the Great Brooch Incident. Richard's cousin Margaret had stopped by unannounced, ostensibly to check on the children, but really to get another look at the woman who had caused such family upheaval. She had arrived during lunch, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer outfit a stark contrast to the casual family atmosphere. "I hope I'm not intruding," she had said, though her tone suggested she neither hoped nor cared. "Of course not," Richard had replied, though he had felt Naomi stiffen beside him. "We were just finishing lunch. Kids, say hello to Cousin Margaret." Emma and Marcus had offered polite but unenthusiastic greetings before returning to their sandwiches. "They're so well-behaved," Margaret had observed, her gaze lingering on Naomi. "You must be very firm with them." "Actually, they respond better to patience and understanding," Naomi had said mildly. "How interesting. I find children need clear boundaries, strict rules. Of course, I suppose different approaches work for different situations." The conversation had continued in this vein for several uncomfortable minutes, with Margaret making increasingly pointed observations about child-rearing, appropriate behavior, and the importance of proper supervision. Throughout it all, Naomi had remained polite but distant, focusing on clearing the lunch dishes and helping Marcus with his juice box. It was while Naomi was wiping down the counter that Margaret had suddenly gasped. "My brooch," she had exclaimed, her hand flying to her chest. "It's gone." Richard had looked up from his conversation with Emma. "I'm sorry, my grandmother's diamond brooch. I was wearing it when I arrived, and now it's gone." Margaret's voice had risen with each word, carrying clearly through the kitchen and into the dining room where the children sat. "Are you sure?" Richard had asked. "Maybe it came unclasped in your car, or—" "I'm quite sure," Margaret had interrupted, her eyes fixing pointedly on Naomi. "I remember admiring it in your hallway mirror when I arrived. Someone must have taken it." The implication had hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Emma and Marcus had stopped eating, sensing the sudden tension. Naomi had gone very still, her back to the room as she finished wiping the counter. "That's a serious accusation," Richard had said carefully. "I'm not accusing anyone specifically," Margaret had replied, though her gaze never left Naomi. "I'm simply stating facts. I arrived with the brooch, and now it's missing." Richard had felt the familiar weight of his family's expectations, their whispered warnings about trust and appearances. For one terrible moment, doubt had crept in. He had looked at Naomi's rigid posture, her silence, and wondered if his mother had been right about his judgment being compromised. "Perhaps we should search the house," Margaret had continued. "Check everyone's belongings. Surely an innocent person wouldn't object to that." Finally, Naomi had turned around. Her face was composed but pale, her eyes holding a hurt so deep it had made Richard's chest ache. "Of course," she had said quietly. "I understand your concern." The next few minutes had been among the most shameful of Richard's life. He had stood by while Margaret demanded to search Naomi's purse, her coat pockets, even the simple gold necklace she wore, a gift from her deceased father. Each violation had felt like a betrayal, but the doubt in his mind had kept him paralyzed. It was Emma who had broken the spell. "Cousin Margaret," she had said in her clear, innocent voice, "why is your brooch in your purse?" Everyone had turned to stare. Margaret's expensive handbag sat open on the counter where she had placed it while conducting her search. And there, nestled between her wallet and car keys, was the glint of diamonds. "That's impossible," Margaret had stammered, rushing to her purse. "I would never. It must have fallen in when I—" But as she pulled out the brooch, the truth had been unavoidable. The clasp was secure, unbroken. There was no way it could have simply fallen into her bag. The silence had been deafening. Marcus had looked confused, Emma triumphant, and Naomi had simply stood there, her dignity intact despite everything she had just endured. I don't understand," Margaret had said weakly. "I was certain. You were certain that the black woman must have stolen it," Richard had said, his voice deadly quiet. "So certain that you were willing to humiliate an innocent person rather than check your own belongings." "That's not. I never said." "You didn't have to say it." Richard had felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a bone setting after being broken. "Your assumptions were clear enough." Margaret had left quickly after that, her apologies hollow and her embarrassment profound. But the damage had been done, not to Naomi, whose grace under pressure had only highlighted her character, but to Richard's relationship with his own judgment. He had found Naomi in the laundry room afterward, folding the children's clothes with unusual intensity. "I'm sorry," he had said. She hadn't looked up. "For what?" "For doubting you. For letting her humiliate you. For not standing up immediately." "You have a lot to lose," Naomi had said simply. "I understand the pressure you're under. That's no excuse." Richard had leaned against the doorframe, watching her careful, methodical movements. "I let their fear make me question what I knew to be true. That was on me, not you." Finally, she had looked up. "What do you know to be true? That you love my children. That they love you. That you've brought healing to this house in ways I didn't think were possible. And that anyone who can't see that is blind." Tears had gathered in Naomi's eyes, but she had blinked them away. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I have some calls to make." The confrontations that followed had been swift and decisive. Richard had called each family member who had questioned his judgment, making it clear that their opinions were no longer welcome. He had resigned from his mother's charitable boards, declined invitations to family gatherings, and gradually distanced himself from anyone who couldn't accept Naomi as part of their lives. The final showdown had come at Christmas. Eleanor had called a family meeting, gathering the full Hartwell clan at her estate under the pretense of holiday planning. Richard had suspected it was an ambush, but he had gone anyway, bringing Emma and Marcus with him. He had been right. The family had assembled in Eleanor's formal living room like a tribunal. Catherine and Margaret sat on the burgundy sofa, his uncles flanked the fireplace, and various cousins filled the remaining chairs. Eleanor herself held court from her usual spot in the wingback chair that had belonged to Richard's grandfather. "We need to discuss your situation." Eleanor had begun without preamble. "This has gone on long enough." "What situation?" Richard had asked, though he knew. "Your infatuation with this maid. Your children's inappropriate attachment. The damage you're doing to all of our reputations." Emma and Marcus had been playing quietly in the corner, but Richard had seen them glance up at the mention of Naomi. "My children's happiness isn't damaging anyone's reputation, isn't it?" Catherine had interjected. "Emma's teacher asked me pointed questions at the school fundraiser. People are talking, Richard. They're wondering about your judgment, your fitness as a father. Let them wonder." "You can't mean that," Margaret had said. "Think about their futures. Emma will need to marry well someday. Marcus will need the right connections for business. How does having a—" She had glanced at the children and lowered her voice. "A domestic as a mother figure prepare them for that? It prepares them to value character over color, loyalty over lineage, love over status." His Uncle Harold had snorted. "Pretty words, but the world doesn't work that way. You're setting them up for disappointment. I'm setting them up for decency." The argument had escalated quickly, voices rising despite the presence of the children. Eleanor had finally called for order, her authority silencing the room. "Richard," she had said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of Hartwell expectations. "You have a choice to make. Your family or this woman. You cannot have both." The ultimatum had hung in the air like a blade. Richard had looked around the room at faces he had known since childhood, people who had celebrated his successes and mourned his losses. His family, bound by blood and history and shared experiences. Then he had looked at Emma and Marcus, who had stopped playing to watch the adults with wide, worried eyes. "You're right," he had said quietly. "I do have a choice to make." He had stood, helped his children gather their toys, and walked toward the door. "Richard," Eleanor's voice had cracked like a whip. "If you leave now, don't expect us to welcome you back." He had paused in the doorway, his children's hands in his. "A woman named Naomi Washington has shown my family more love in 8 months than you've shown in 2 years of grief. She sees Emma's nightmares not as inconvenience, but as healing that needs time. She hears Marcus's silence not as defiance, but as a little boy processing loss. She holds them when they cry for their mother and celebrates when they laugh again. That's what family looks like." "She's not family," Margaret had protested. "She's staff." "No," Richard had said firmly. "Staff is what you hire to maintain your image. Family is what you choose to heal your heart." The drive home had been quiet. Emma had finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" "No, sweetheart. We're free." They had found Naomi in the kitchen, preparing dinner and humming softly. She had looked up as they entered, taking in their expressions with the intuitive understanding that had made her so irreplaceable. "How was the family meeting?" she had asked. "Illuminating," Richard had replied. "They wanted me to choose between them and you." Naomi had gone still. "And I chose honesty. I chose integrity. I chose the person who puts my children's needs before social expectations." The smile that had spread across Naomi's face had been like sunrise after a long night. "I chose you," Richard had said simply, "and I'd make the same choice every day for the rest of my life." Emma had run to hug Naomi around the waist. "We choose you too, Miss Naomi." Marcus, not to be outdone, had attached himself to her other side. "You make the best pancakes." Standing in his kitchen, watching the three most important people in his life embrace, Richard had understood something profound. Family wasn't about shared DNA or social status or meeting others' expectations. Family was about showing up again and again with love and patience and unwavering commitment. It was about choosing each other every single day. The consequences had been swift and predictable. Invitations stopped coming. Business relationships grew cool. The Hartwell name, which had opened doors for generations, suddenly carried whispers of scandal and poor judgment. Richard hadn't cared. His children flourished under Naomi's continued care. Emma's nightmares became less frequent, replaced by dreams of adventures and possibilities. Marcus's vocabulary exploded as he gained confidence in a house filled with patience and encouragement. They both excelled in school, not because they were pushed or pressured, but because they felt secure enough to take risks and make mistakes. The three of them had created new traditions to replace the old ones. Sunday morning pancakes in shapes that told stories. Evening walks through the neighborhood, collecting interesting leaves and smooth stones. Bedtime routines that included not just stories, but conversations about hopes and fears and the kind of people they wanted to become. And through it all, Naomi had remained what she had always been, not a replacement for Sarah, but a unique presence who honored the past while nurturing the future. She kept Sarah's memory alive through stories and songs, and the kind of unconditional love that transcended biology. The final validation had come from an unexpected source. Richard's father-in-law, George, had shown up at the house one spring evening, his usual stern expression softer than Richard remembered. "I owe you an apology," he had said without preamble. "For what?" "For questioning your judgment. For suggesting Sarah wouldn't approve." George had looked around the living room, taking in the children's artwork on the walls, the comfortable chaos of a home filled with life. "She would have loved Naomi. I know she would have. More than that," George had continued, "she would have been proud of you. For defending someone who couldn't defend herself. For choosing your children's happiness over social approval. For being the kind of father she always knew you could be." They had sat in companionable silence, watching through the window as Naomi and the children played in the garden. Emma was teaching Marcus to plant seeds in the patch where Sarah's roses grew, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "She's not trying to replace Sarah," George had observed. "No," Richard had agreed. "She's helping us remember why Sarah's love was worth preserving." As the seasons passed, Richard occasionally encountered former friends at business functions or community events. Some approached with awkward attempts at reconciliation, finally recognizing Naomi's positive influence on his children. Others maintained their distance, their disapproval evident in pursed lips and turned backs. Richard had learned to distinguish between the two groups quickly and to value only the opinions of those who could see past their prejudices to recognize genuine love and commitment. The ultimate measure of his choice had come during Emma's school play. She had been cast as the lead in a production about courage and standing up for what's right. As she delivered her final monologue about choosing kindness over conformity, Richard had felt a hand slip into his. Naomi had sat beside him in the darkened auditorium, her eyes bright with pride as she watched Emma shine on stage. In the row behind them, Marcus had whispered loudly enough for several parents to hear. "That's my sister, and that's my Miss Naomi." No awkwardness, no shame, just pure, uncomplicated love and pride. After the performance, as parents milled about congratulating the young actors, Richard had watched several families approach them. Not with the careful distance he had grown accustomed to, but with genuine warmth. Emma's teacher had made a point of complimenting Naomi on how well-adjusted and confident Emma had become. Other parents had shared stories of their own children's friendships with Emma and Marcus, praising their kindness and inclusivity. "Your children are special," one mother had told Richard. "They see people's hearts first. That's rare." Richard had glanced at Naomi, who was helping Marcus fix his clip-on tie. They had a good teacher. Standing there in that elementary school hallway, surrounded by the ordinary magic of childhood achievement and community support, Richard had felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Not the fragile peace of avoiding conflict, but the deep satisfaction of knowing he had chosen correctly when it mattered most. The drive home had been filled with Emma's excited chatter about her performance and Marcus's demands for ice cream to celebrate. Naomi had suggested they stop at their favorite diner, a small, family-owned place where the waitress knew their usual orders and always brought extra whipped cream for Marcus's hot chocolate. As they had settled into their familiar booth, Emma had grown suddenly serious. "Daddy," she had said, "some kids at school say it's weird that Miss Naomi lives with us." Richard had felt his protective instincts sharpen, but before he could respond, Marcus had piped up with the confidence of a child who had never doubted his world. "That's silly," he had declared. "Miss Naomi makes our house happy. Why would that be weird?" "Because she's not our real family," Emma had continued, clearly working through something she'd been thinking about. Naomi had reached across the table, covering Emma's small hand with her own. "What do you think makes someone real family?" Emma had considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. "Taking care of each other, staying when things are hard, loving even when you're mad. And do we do those things every day?" Emma had said with certainty. "Then maybe," Naomi had suggested gently, "the kids who say it's weird just don't understand that families can look lots of different ways." Richard had felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what his mother and sister had failed to understand: that love creates family, not the other way around. The conversation had stayed with him as they returned home, as he tucked the children into bed, as he found Naomi in the kitchen preparing tomorrow's lunch boxes with her usual quiet efficiency. "Thank you," he had said. "For what this time?" she had asked with a gentle smile. "For helping them understand that different doesn't mean wrong. For showing them that family is about choice and commitment, not just biology." Naomi had paused in her packing of Emma's favorite crackers. "My grandmother used to say that the heart doesn't see color, only character. Some people spend their whole lives learning that lesson. Your children already know it. Because of you." "Because of you," she had corrected. "You chose love over fear. You chose them over approval. Children learn more from what we do than what we say." That night, Richard had made a decision that had been forming in his mind for months. The next morning, he had called his lawyer. "I need to update my will," he had said, "and I want to establish some legal protections." The conversation that followed had been complex but necessary. Richard wanted to ensure that if anything happened to him, Naomi would have legal guardianship of Emma and Marcus. More than that, he wanted to secure her future, college funds for any children she might have, a house of her own, the security that would let her make choices based on love rather than necessity. "Are you sure about this?" his lawyer had asked. "It's very generous, but it might raise questions. The only question that matters is what's best for my children. And what's best for them is Naomi." The legal arrangements had taken weeks to finalize, but Richard had felt lighter with each document signed. He was protecting not just his children's future, but the future of the woman who had made their healing possible. He had told Naomi about the arrangements on a quiet Sunday evening while the children watched a movie in the living room. Her reaction had been everything he'd expected: gratitude mixed with protests that she didn't deserve such generosity. "You deserve security," he had said firmly. "You deserve to know that your loyalty and love are valued, not just appreciated. The children's love is all the payment I need. I know. That's exactly why you deserve more." The years that followed had proven Richard's judgment sound in ways both large and small. Emma had grown into a confident teenager who stood up for classmates facing bullying, who chose friends based on character rather than status, who spoke fluent Spanish thanks to Naomi's patient tutoring. Marcus had become a thoughtful boy who saw the best in everyone, who mediated playground disputes with wisdom beyond his years, who treated everyone from the school janitor to his teacher with equal respect. They had become the kind of people Sarah would have been proud to call her children, not because they were perfect, but because they were kind. The ultimate vindication had come during Richard's darkest hour. He had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer during Emma's sophomore year of high school. The prognosis was uncertain, the treatment grueling, and the fear of leaving his children overwhelming. It had been Naomi who held the family together during those months of chemotherapy and radiation. She had driven him to appointments when he was too weak to drive himself. She had sat with the children during procedures, answering their frightened questions with honesty tempered by hope. She had managed his household, his schedule, and his emotional needs with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. But more than that, she had loved him through it, not romantically, but with the fierce, protective love of chosen family. She had fought for him with doctors who wanted to dismiss his pain, advocated for him when he was too sick to advocate for himself, and never once made him feel like a burden. During his lowest moment, when the third round of chemotherapy had left him weak and nauseated and convinced he was going to die, she had sat beside his hospital bed and spoken truths he needed to hear. "Those children of yours are going to be fine," she had said firmly. "You raised them to be strong and kind and resilient. Even if the worst happens, which it won't, they'll carry your love with them always. I wanted more time with them, and you'll have it. But Richard, even if you didn't, you've already given them everything they need. You chose love over fear. You showed them that family is about commitment, not convention. You taught them to see people's hearts before their faces. That's a legacy that will last generations." He had recovered, slowly, painfully, but completely. The cancer had gone into remission, giving him the second chance he had prayed for. But the experience had crystallized something important. Naomi wasn't just Emma and Marcus's caregiver. She was his family too. The recognition ceremony had been Emma's idea. "We should have a family day," she had announced during dinner one evening. "A day to celebrate being us." "What kind of celebration?" Richard had asked. "I don't know. Something official. Something that shows everyone that we're a real family, even if we don't all have the same last name." The ceremony had been small, but meaningful. They had gathered in the backyard where Sarah's roses bloomed alongside the vegetable garden Naomi and the children had planted together. Richard's father-in-law George had officiated, reading words they had written together about commitment and choice and the many forms that love could take. It wasn't a wedding or an adoption. It was something entirely their own. A recognition that they were bound not by law or blood, but by something stronger. The daily choice to show up for each other, to put each other's needs first, to create something beautiful from the raw materials of loss and hope. "We are family," Richard had said, looking at the three people who had become his everything. "Because we choose to be. Because we see each other fully and love what we see. Because we know that the heart's capacity for love is infinite when we stop trying to limit it." Emma had cried, happy tears that sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight. Marcus had whooped with joy, and Naomi had simply smiled, her hand over her heart, her eyes bright with the kind of peace that comes from being truly seen and accepted. The final chapter of their story had been written not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments. Emma's graduation from high school, where she gave a valedictorian speech about the courage to love across differences. Marcus's science fair victory, achieved through a project on plant genetics that Naomi had patiently helped him understand. Sunday morning pancakes that still came in shapes that told stories. Evening walks that had expanded to include neighborhood dogs and elderly neighbors who had become honorary grandparents. Richard had kept some of his professional relationships, but had built new ones based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. He had found clients who valued his integrity, partners who shared his principles, friends who understood that strength sometimes meant standing alone until others were brave enough to join you. Most importantly, he had learned to trust his own judgment completely. Not the judgment clouded by fear or influenced by others' expectations, but the clear-eyed assessment of a father who knew his children, understood their needs, and refused to let anyone else define their family's boundaries. The house that had once echoed with absence now rang with laughter, argument, music, and all the beautiful chaos of a life lived fully. Sarah's presence was still felt. In the roses that bloomed each spring, in the lullabies that Naomi sang, in the way Richard told stories about the woman who had given him the foundation to build something new. But it was Naomi's presence that filled the spaces where grief had once lived. Her patience, her wisdom, her unwavering commitment to seeing the best in everyone she encountered. She had taught them all that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to carry love forward in new forms. On quiet evenings, when the children were doing homework and dinner was simmering on the stove, Richard sometimes stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, watching his family exist in their comfortable rhythms. Naomi helping Marcus with math while Emma practiced violin, all three of them chattering about their days, their dreams, their plans for tomorrow. In those moments, he felt Sarah's approval like a warm breeze. Not because he had replaced her, but because he had honored her greatest wish, that their children grow up surrounded by love, guided by wisdom, and free to become their best selves. The story that had begun with doubt and prejudice had become something else entirely, a testament to the truth that families are built not by accident of birth, but by conscious choice. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite the cost. That love, real love, sees character before color, heart before heritage, soul before social status. And in the end, Richard had learned the most important lesson of all, that when you choose love over fear, when you choose your children's happiness over others' approval, when you choose to see people as they truly are rather than as society expects them to be, you don't just change your own life. You change the world, one choice at a time. Standing in that doorway, listening to the sounds of his chosen family living their beautifully ordinary life, Richard smiled and whispered the words that had become his daily prayer. Thank you, Sarah, for teaching me that love multiplies when shared. Thank you, Naomi, for showing me that family is a verb, not a noun. And thank you, Emma and Marcus, for reminding me every day that the greatest legacy we can leave is children who know how to love without limits. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, and Richard stepped forward to join it, leaving the doorway and the doubts behind forever. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.